I wrote this book, Beatles Gear, with the intent of trying to catalog all the Beatles equipment and everything they've ever used on all the great records that we listen to and also on their live performances. The reason why I did the book was I'm in a band myself called the Chesterfield Kings, and a lot of our own recordings, we were always trying to sound like the Beatles or the Stones or the Kinks or the Pretty Things or all these other great bands that I grew up listening to. And as we recorded records, we always found out that, well, we have the right equipment, but there's more to it. So I'd research more and more, and so sure enough, I decided to write this book. And when I did so, I thought every musician always remembers his first instrument. So I thought I'd start before the Beatles, when the Beatles were actually the quarrymen. So this is an image of John, George, and Paul with their very first instruments, as they started as a skiffle band, being the quarrymen. They had very inexpensive instruments. They weren't even amplified. And George was playing a Hofner. Paul was playing a Zenith. And John had this guitar that was guaranteed not to split. He bought it out of a magazine. In any case, as a skiffle band, they managed to get enough money together and record a song. So that I'm going to play you In Spite of All the Danger, and I'm sure all of you have heard the song. But you could hear a skiffle band at this point, but they started to rock out a little bit as it became very popular to be, a rock and roll band. And the Beatles, or before they were the Beatles, the Quarrymen followed suit. And they started to put little pickups on their acoustic instruments to electrify them. And John even went so far as to get a new electric guitar that his Aunt Mimi bought him for 17 pounds. We actually found the original purchase hire receipt that they bought it in Liverpool, and we published that in the book. In any case, as they turned into a rock and roll band, they got their friend Stu Sutcliffe to be the bass player, and they auditioned to possibly play in Germany, which they won the audition, and sure enough, they ended up at the Indra Club, where at this point, they all had electric instruments. You have John with his Hofner Club 40 guitar. You have Pete Best joining the band on his new Premier drum set. Stu Sutcliffe on his Hofner bass, which he bought with the money that he won from an art show, and Paul playing an electric guitar too. Now George is playing a thing called the Futurama, which resembles a lot like a Fender Stratocaster. And from all the bands that I interviewed in Liverpool, everyone told me that the one instrument everybody wanted to get, but just couldn't find in England, was the Fender Stratocaster. Everybody looked at that Buddy Holly Crickets record, and they're holding that Fender Strat, and that was like the holy grail. So to them, they just really wanted to get a Fender Strat, but there was a trade embargo in England, and you couldn't get American-made instruments in England at the time, and it wasn't lifted until late 1959. So this is George with a Futurama guitar, the closest thing he could get to an actual American-made Fender. While in Germany, John actually went into a music store and saw this really neat-looking Rickenbacker, and he ended up buying it. He put some money down on it. And as the story goes, he never paid off the rest of it, made off back to England before he ever paid the rest of the bill. Yoko was very kind and allowed us to photograph John's instruments for the book. And this is how John's first Rickenbacker exists today. The Beatles cut their teeth in Germany and went back to Liverpool, and were doing quite well. But Stu didn't go back with them. And as it goes, Paul became the bass player. Here's a very rare picture of Paul with a Hofner, his very first one. And oddly enough, Stu's in the same picture, and he's holding a bass as well. So this is when they went back to Germany. When they're back in Germany, they befriended Tony Sheridan, and Tony told me when I interviewed him for the book that he would often hang out with the Beatles and they would play his guitars. And sure enough, there was a recording to be made, and the Beatles were invited to play on that recording. So I want to play you Cry for a Shadow, and the reason why is because you could hear how the electric instruments and the addition of the bass guitar really made a big difference. We'll take a brief listen to that. How they were starting to evolve their sound, obviously working days and nights in Germany playing all the time. They went back to Germany, and when they were there, something happened to George. He found a Fender Stratocaster that was for sale, used at a music store, but he didn't have enough money to buy it. So what happened was there was another band on the bill with them by the name of Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and the guitar player, Johnny Guitar was his name, relayed a story to me, and he said that George wanted to buy this guitar, but he didn't have enough money, so he asked Rory if he could borrow some money, and Rory said, sure, yeah, we'll meet you at the music store tomorrow, and we'll lend you the money, and you can buy yourself the Fender Strat. Well, as Johnny Guitar continued the story, he said that he found out about it, and he convinced Rory the night before. He said, why are we going to lend the Beatles money for a guitar? We should get the Fender Strat for our band, because then we'll be a cooler band than the Beatles. So they went to the music store the next day, the Hurricanes, and they bought the Fender Strat. As Johnny continued to tell me the story, he said, lo and behold, the Beatles show up, and they see what happened. And George was devastated that he wasn't going to get his Fender Stratocaster that he really wanted. And John Lennon was so pissed off about the whole thing, he got in a fist fight with the guitar player over a Fender Strat. All for a Fender Strat. Well, they went back to Liverpool, and George saw in the Liverpool Echo there was a guy selling a Gretsch guitar. And George was very fond of Chet Atkins, and so he went to go buy the guitar for £75. And this is the guitar that George bought, the Gretsch Duo Jet. This is the actual guitar as it exists today, and it belongs part of the Harrison estate. At this point, the Beatles were getting quite popular in Liverpool, as we all know, and they had their cool vibe going with the leathers and everything, but there was a guy, Brian Epstein, that heard about them, and he wanted to manage them. One of the things that he convinced them is that, look, you're going to have to get rid of the leathers and put on some suits. So they started wearing suits. The other thing that was going on is they had been promised a record contract, and there was some issues with Pete Best, and I'm sure everybody knows that story. I'm sure Pete's attended a bunch of the Beatle Fests before. But this is a rare picture where Paul switches to drums and Pete's being the lead singer of the band. And actually, if you go back, George is playing Paul's Hofner bass, but upside down. Paul, the drummer. Well, when Epstein took the band over, he took them, and the first recordings they did at EMI, he was pulled aside and he was told, look, if these guys are going to be professional, they're going to have to get good new equipment. The other thing that they decided to do was switch out drummers. There was this cool drummer that they knew in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. His name was Ringo. And so he ended up joining the Beatles, as we all know, and brought over with him the premier drum set that had his name written on it, Ringo Starr, with little stars for the O's. Like I said, Brian Epstein was warned, look, if these guys are going to be professional, they're going to have to get some professional equipment. So, Brian took note of it and took George and John to a place called Rushworth's in Liverpool, where they ordered a pair of Gibson jumbo guitars. Tony Sheridan told me this story that when they were in Germany, they would often borrow his guitar. He had a thing called a Gibson ES 175, which is a big jazz guitar, and they would refer to it as the Gibson Jumbo, and they'd say, Tony, can we borrow the Gibson Jumbo? And he'd let them borrow it. So as he continued telling me the story, he said that when they went into Rushworth's, they ordered Gibson Jumbos, and the place didn't have any in stock. They had to be ordered from here in the U.S. So the guy looked it up in the 1962 Gibson catalog, and the J stands for Jumbo, and he found the model, the 160E, and so it was the electric Jumbo. So he thought he was ordering a jazz guitar for John and George, but what actually showed up were these two really groovy-looking Gibson J160Es. Instead of saying, hey, you got the wrong guitar, we wanted something else, like young guys they were just happy to have two new guitars, so they grabbed them. They took delivery of these. This picture was taken September 10th, 1962. The very next day, they went in to record Love Me Do. The guitars were used on that record, and They ended up using these guitars on photo sessions. They were very proud of them. Of all the Beatle guitars used throughout their career, the Gibson J160E is the only guitar that they used on their very first record, and they used it throughout their career up until their last recordings, the Abbey Road sessions. This is George's actual Gibson J160E. Well, Ringo was playing the premiere set, but they had him put this cool-looking Beatles bug logo on the front of the drum head. It's actually painted on a piece of cloth and just stretched over the front of the drum head. But Ringo, too, needed a new set of some new drums, and he needed new gear, something updated, and he wanted a set of Ludwig drums. He wanted an American-made drum set. So they went to Drum City in Shaftesbury Avenue in London. They met with a guy by the name of Ivor Arbiter. And Arbiter had the Ludwig line, and Ringo was very proud of the idea of playing Ludwig drums. So he told Arbiter that he wanted the name Ludwig on the front of the drums so everybody could see he was playing an American set of drums. And Ivor continued to tell me the story that then Brian Epstein told him, he said, well, look, you guys aren't called the Ludwigs. We better put the Beatles on, they're bigger. So Ivor told me that he literally pulled out a piece of paper and took and drew out the word the Beatles, the words the Beatles with the drop T to make it, accentuate the word beat. And the Beatles logo, as we know it, was literally created in seconds on this guy's desk. So Ringo took delivery of that drum set on May 12th, 1963, while they were filming Thank Your Lucky Stars. This is during the rehearsals of that show, and this is the actual show that was presented that night with the famous drum set that we all know and love. This is Ringo's actual 20-inch drum set. Ringo allowed me to go through all his drums and actually take a look at, figure out what he had. They were just like in stacks, so we had to sort it all out for him. This is the backside of that same drum set, and I was asking one of his guys, I said, well, doesn't he want like the drum heads changed so he could still play them? They were like dusty on the inner curves of the heads. And apparently Ringo doesn't want any of the dust touched on it because he says it's Beatle dust. Well, by this time, the Beatles had hits, and they were very aware of the concept of adding instruments other than just guitar-based drums to their recordings. What I'd like to play for you right now is From Me to You. And this is interesting to listen because we'll listen to an outtake of just without the harmonica. Adding a single instrument to a recording really changes the feel of a song. And the Beatles were well aware of this very early on. And as I go through this, we'll explore some of that. That's really the whole point of my book. If the Beatles didn't use the instruments they used on those recordings, those records wouldn't sound like that. They'd sound drastically different. With their popularity, they were doing a lot of road work, and their equipment was getting, kind of beat up a little bit. Paul's famous Hofner bass, this is his very first one, and if you notice, there's two pickups in the front position. They're towards the neck. Well, the thing, started getting a little tattered to the point where in this picture you actually see the forward pickup has tape taped around it because it was somewhat falling apart. The pickup would just fall out of the instrument. Paul loved that Hofner, so what did he do? He went and got a new one. And this one is the one that we see most often in all the films and the television performances. And the way you could tell the difference is the two pickups are spread apart. There's one by the bridge position and one at the neck position. This is Paul's actual Hofner that he uses to this day. The instrument, you probably see him playing live shows currently. This is the same instrument that after he's done with the show, he takes it off and he throws it to John Hamill, his guitar tech, and John's supposed to catch it. After one of the shows, I was talking to John, and I said, that's got to be nerve-wracking every time he throws this thing. I mean, the thing's worth a fortune. He goes, yeah, that's how he tests my loyalty. Well, with the Beatles, instruments became like a really cool thing that they could afford more, and the guy out of all the Beatles that I really feel liked instruments more, guitars more than anything was George. Good case in point is when in Brian Epstein's book, Cellar Full of Noise, when he states in there when the Beatles got signed to EMI, they were in Germany at the time, so he sent them a telegram to tell them so. And the response that he got from the Beatles individually, from Paul, he said, "When can you wire me 10,000 pounds?" From John, it was, "When will we be millionaires?" From George, "Will you please order me 4 new guitars?" So, eventually, George got his wish. Here he is with the Gretsch Country Gentleman, which he used on quite a few of the recordings. George actually had 2 of them. He also experimented with some other guitars. This is an Australian-made Melotron guitar, and it's kind of rare because he only used it for a very short time. And these are some rare pictures of the Beatles performing live in '63 using the Melotron guitar. This is how the guitar exists today. This is the actual one that he used. There's been some books written about George's visit to Illinois here in the United States in September of 1963. And, they're really interesting reads, but he came to visit his sister. And during the visit, he picked up a Rickenbacker so he could kind of match John's guitar. John had his blonde Rickenbacker painted black. And when George went into this music store and talked to the guy, it was actually a red color guitar, Fireglow, and he wanted it to be black so it would match John's guitar. So the guy said, "Come back in a week and I'll make it black for you," and he did. So this is George with that guitar playing on Ready, Steady, Go, and then again on Thank Your Lucky Stars. And it's a kind of a neat guitar because, again, he used it for a short time, and then years later, he gave it to a friend of his, George Peckham, from the Foremost, who ended up adding a pickup to it. But of all the guitars, he went back to the Gretsch guitars because these are the guitars that he preferred. As a matter of fact, in this picture, you see him tuning the Rickenbacker. It's held sideways, but he's with his famous Gretsch. And as I said, George really liked his guitars to the point where he'd actually polish them and change his own strings and whatnot. By the time the end of '63, he ended up getting another new Gretsch guitar, and this is the Gretsch Tennessean. And that's him again using it on the London Palladium show, December of '63. And this is him using it again during the Paris shows in the beginning of 1964. The one picture that I find probably the most striking of all Beatle images is really this famous shot of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. It did a lot of things for the Beatles, obviously, to conquer the United States, but it really changed the whole structure of music here in the United States, and it really should be pointed out that bands prior to this evening in 1964 would really use Fender and Gibson guitars here in the United States, okay? Most professional bands, that's what they would use. They'd use Fender amplifiers typically. Well, here's this band, and they show up on TV with these great-looking hairdos, great-sounding music, cool suits, Beatle boots, and they got these groovy-looking guitars that, Hofner guitars were uncommon here. They didn't even distribute their instruments here in the United States. The Gretsch guitars, they were more associated with cowboy music and country and western stuff, and Rickenbacker was a tiny, tiny little company in California that, didn't sell that many guitars, frankly. Now, if you think about it, this is a very iconic image of the Beatles and what we know. If you stop and think, what if they showed up on Ed Sullivan with these instruments? Wouldn't it be the same impact, Here's a picture of the Beatles from 1963, and their equipment didn't show up in time, so they were using the opening band's gear. John's playing a Gibson 335 style guitar. Paul's playing a right-handed guitar upside down. That's how good he was. And oddly enough, George is playing a Fender Stratocaster in this one. But it's really this image of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan that really changed primarily the shopping list for all kids here in the United States, because literally that week, every kid across the United States was trying to be a Beatle and start a garage band, and they wanted Hofner basses, they wanted Gretsch guitars, they wanted Rickenbackers. They also wanted Vox amps, because the Beatles use Vox. The other thing is the Ludwig drum set, and that name, the Beatles, on there. It's just so iconic. This is the actual drum head. A good friend of mine, Russ Leese, owns this drum head. You could talk to Russ about it. He's got a booth in the sale place over there, and he actually owns this drum head. When the Beatles were in New York for these shows, they were contacted by the owner of Rickenbacker ahead of time, and he set up an appointment with them because he had heard through one of the distributors in England that the Beatles used Rickenbacker. Two of the guys in the Beatles were using Rickenbacker. So he was shrewd enough to grab some prototypes and an amplifier and head over to New York and had a meeting with the Beatles, and he set this up through Brian Epstein. George was sick in bed, so they actually brought the amplifier into his hotel room, and they gave him this really cool-looking Rickenbacker 12-string. This is the actual Rickenbacker 12-string that was given to George that was used on, oh, so many great records. They left the United States, went back to England, and immediately started recording tracks that would appear in their upcoming film. Well, if you're a young band and you're on a roll and you get a new toy, you better use it in the studio. So on the Hard Day's Night recordings, the Rickenbacker 12-string was used on a ton of stuff. And what I'd like to play you right now are some pretty cool sounding outtakes of the beginning chord of A Hard Day's Night. And you hear how they're trying to... They ended up trying to put the Rick 12-string on quite a few of the actual songs. And the genius of the Beatles, they knew when to stop and not force the issue. And let's take a listen to a case in point on that. I'm going to play And I Love... They knew better than to just force it on every song. For that matter, John really liked the Rick 12-string too, so much so that he actually ordered himself a Rick 12-string in the size of his little black one that he had. Like I said, the cool thing was they thought, well, we could make this song sound a lot different if we put different instrumentation to it. And so let's actually take a look at what they really did with the song. And they added a classical guitar, very genius in the way that they would orchestrate their songs. And by the time the film A Hard Day's Night came out, it was a big smash. And this Rickenbacker 12-string, it was a prototype guitar. No one had them. You couldn't buy them. The British press actually dubbed the thing the Beat Boys' secret weapon. And it was an instrument that, by the time the film came out, it really struck a chord here in the United States. One of the people I interviewed for the book was Roger McGuinn from the Byrds. And Roger told me that the Byrds had just got signed to Columbia Records, and they were about to record their first album. And the film came out, and the whole band went to go see it, and they stayed 4 times to watch the film over and over, studying the Beatles. And they were also studying this Rickenbacker guitar, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And then Roger told me he finally figured out it was a 12-string. So he went out and found Rickenbacker and bought one just like it, which in turn they ended up recording their famous Byrds records with and using the 12-string as the main instrument, totally influenced by the Beatles. Had the Beatles not decided to use the Rick 12-string, they would have never influenced the Byrds, and we wouldn't have all those great records from the Byrds. So it's kind of really important, like I said, the instruments. John received a new Rickenbacker similar to his very first one. Rickenbacker gave it to him, and this is a picture of John playing the second one, which had a white pickguard to it. This is the actual instrument. Again, Yoko was very kind and allowed us to photograph John's instruments for use in the book. Well, at this point, the Beatles are huge, and the manufacturer is very hip to it. And companies like Hofner were cashing in on the Beatles and making things like strings and swing tags for the instruments were, relating it to the Beatles. John started playing the harmonica, so sure enough, companies like Horner were doing harmonica things. Vox was supplying them equipment day one, and they were very happy about it because it really brought a huge business for them here in the United States. And with that said, the other American companies, Fender and Gibson, their sales were plummeting because kids didn't want that stuff. They wanted the stuff that the Beatles played. The American company Ludwig, they were very happy about the Beatles. William Ludwig told me that they had to put 3 shifts on, and all the orders were for the famous Ringo drums, Black Oyster Pearl, and everyone was ordering the Ludwig drums at that point with the name Ludwig on it. They generated so much money for Ludwig that William Ludwig actually decided to take a snare drum and have it gold-plated and present it to Ringo during the 1964 tour, and this is actually William Ludwig standing right next to Ringo giving him the drum. Ringo allowed me to photograph all his stuff, and this is actually the gold drum. Ringo still has it to this day. As I said, companies like Rickenbacker, they were cashing in on the Beatles in ads and all kinds of stuff. And John, as he ordered the Rickenbacker 12-string, similar to his other small one, he got it finally, and he was very happy with it. This is the actual instrument as it exists today. And he used it briefly. This is him in Holland with Jimmy Nicole sitting in for Ringo. And this is a show in Boston where he's playing it, backstage with the same guitar. And then you see John and Paul's guitars getting ready for a show. At this point, the Beatles are, as I said, hugely successful, and they could take the time to experiment a little bit in the studio, which they really wanted to do, and they did. They would also stumble upon things, and in that stumble, they would find a way of actually using it. And the thing I'm going to play for you right now is the beginning of I Feel Fine. Now, we've heard it a million times, but what actually happened was John had his Gibson J160E leaning on an amplifier, and Paul happened to hit a specific note on the bass, and they realized that they could actually get the guitar to feed back and create that buzzing sound in the beginning of the song that we all hear. And they found that they could actually do it time and time again. So this is kind of an interesting thing to listen to. There's a whole mess of versions here of them trying to work out the beginning of this song. Ended up using it on the song. Another thing that they tried to do in the studio, George was working on Babies in Black, and he borrowed this thing called a volume pedal from his friend Colin Manley, who was in the Remo 4. They grew up together, and they studied Chet Atkins records, and he wanted to try to use this on the record. Well, Colin told me that George couldn't organize his foot and play the guitar at the same time to do it, and he ended up having John standing in front of the guitar and actually turning the volume knob up and down on the guitar while they were doing it. He ended up actually using the effect, and here's Yes It Is, and you hear how, like I said, manufacturers really cashing in on the Beatles, congratulating John, and then turning it into a Beatlebacker. John broke the neck on his second Rickenbacker, and while it was being repaired, they gave him a new one to use. And this is kind of a rare picture because you usually see John using the black Rickenbacker, but for a very brief time, he used this Fireglow Rickenbacker, and here's him playing the guitar live during the 1964 Christmas shows. Paul was hanging around with a guy by the name of John Mayall at the time, and John told me, John's known as the grandfather of British blues. He had this great, amazing blues collection. And he would, after the pubs closed, everyone would go to his apartment, they'd listen to records, and one of the guys was Paul, and he said that Paul would hang out and ask questions about how these old blues guys were getting these great sounds, and he said, well, you gotta have a hollow body. And so Paul went out and bought this really cool Epiphone Casino, and here's him playing it actually upside down. Then you see John playing it, and then George and Paul are both trying to figure out how to flip the strings the other way by moving the bridge. This is the actual guitar as it exists today. Paul allowed us to photograph it for the book, and the strings are now inverted. Paul says that it's his favorite electric guitar. He ended up using it immediately to play the lead on A Ticket to Ride, which a lot of people don't know. During those same December 1964 shows, John and George sent Mel Evans out to go get a Fender Stratocasters for him. The funny part about that story is during the 1964 summer tour here in the United States, Leo Fender and his partner, Don Randall, were really worried about this Beatle band. They said, well, these guys are wrecking our sales. Nobody wants Fender guitars. So they decided Don Randall told me this story. They decided to come up with a huge sum of money and meet with the Beatles in New York and offer them this money and all the free equipment they want just to play Fender. Well, as Don continued to tell me the story, he said that they sent one of their guys to New York to meet with the Beatles, and he had an appointment with them, and he was so nervous that he actually went down to the hotel bar and had a couple of cocktails. So as he continued to tell me the story, he said that this guy had too many cocktails and never met up with the Beatles because he got all liquored up. The funny thing about that story, just months later, John and George both went out and had Mel Evans get them a pair of matching baby blue Fender Stratocasters. And these are pictures of John actually using the guitar on the Ticket to Ride sessions. For the Help LP, what'd you say, 5 minutes? I'm going to mush this all in really quick here. Yes? All right. During the Help sessions, they got a lot of new instruments. This is a 12-string that they got. They had this really groovy pianette instrument, electric piano, which they ended up using on The Night Before and a bunch of the other songs on there, and they actually used it in the film as well. John started using an organ live, and this is the Vox organ that he was using on I'm Down, playing it with his elbow. This is them on Ed Sullivan with that instrument. That's the actual instrument as it exists today. And again, as I said, experimenting in the studio, it was getting to be, a thing that they were trying to go for any kind of sounds they could. And it was the introduction of the sitar that actually really changed a lot of the stuff in the direction on a lot of their records. Ravi Shankar told me that if it wasn't for George Harrison's use of the sitar, I'd try to push this really, really fast here. And I'm going to do this again tomorrow, but in a different room, and hopefully we'll have more time there. So anyhow, they're using these nifty keyboards and stuff, and George Martin was introducing all kinds of new sounds for them in the studio. And these are groovy pictures of them in the studio. How much more time do I got? Okay, I'm going to ignore them. Okay, here we go. This is, Ringo actually had 4 of these drum sets. 2 of them had 20-inch kick drums, and 2 of them had 22-inch kick drums. This is his famous one that was used on most of the recordings, and we photographed that one as well, and it's included in the book. He used it in the Help film, and this is the front side of it. Unfortunately, Ringo told me that all his drum heads are gone. They've been stolen, and this one was actually cut out of the drum. Bummer. Well, in any case, I used photographic evidence in the book, to help tell the story. And here's a picture of George playing bass. It's actually a Burns bass. And then John playing this cool orange Gretsch that he had for a brief time. George playing an SG guitar. Paul ended up getting a left-handed Rickenbacker bass. And a bunch of Fender amps started showing up in the studio that they purchased. George with his SG, and John ended up getting a casino just like George's, like Paul's actually, and this is George's SG. George actually had a casino just like John's. They were purchased at the same time. I'm going as fast as I can. I'm going to fly through these pictures now. Okay, well, we're flying now, all right? We're going to end this thing soon. Anyhow, John, don't listen to him. All right, I have to. So we're pushing this thing. Okay, so John ended up having a Melotron, which is kind of a neat instrument. I could tell you more about that at some other time. And we have these groovy pictures from the Sgt. Pepper session. John took his casino and painted the back of it. This is during Benefit for Mr. Kite. They found some bass harmonicas that were literally in the cupboard, and they ended up using them on the song. John had this cool idea for cutting up tapes and creating the calliope song that you hear on that song. I was going to play it for you, but not tonight. Got to blame them, not me.